Welcome, everybody. Stephen Gray here again, as I'm sure you know, and this is the Stephen Gray Vision YouTube channel. These interviews with leading figures in psychedelics and consciousness transformation are also available in audio format at anchor.fm. That's ANCHOR.fm, and it's connected links to places like Spotify and a few others that I can't remember right now. And so cutting to the chase, as it were, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Maya Shetreat. Excuse me. And I'm going to begin with a quick biographical narrative on her, and then we'll just get into what I think will be a very interesting interview. She's doing some remarkable work. So, Dr. Shetreat is a conventionally trained adult and pediatric neurologist, herbalist, urban farmer, and author of The Dirt Cure, which came out with Simon & Schuster in 2016. She's also a professional Hellenistic astrologer, has studied extensively with elders and master plants in Ecuador, and founded the Terrain Institute to teach others to cultivate their kinship with all beings through herbalism, psychedelics, and other programs. She runs a certification program that teaches these principles and trains people to lead communities in integrating rituals and earth-based practices. Dr. Shetreat also teaches a several-session master class on the science and sacredness of psychedelics, including cannabis in that. Fortunately, or I'm pleased to hear, in which she goes into the comprehensive and most updated science and physiology and the context of sacred tradition and ritual. She's been interviewed by Gaia for their series Psychedelica, and has given many public talks and grand rounds. You might have to explain that one, Maya, as well. Dr. Shetreat also coaches people through microdosing experiences, and I'd also like to hear about that. There's a lot of material just in that little bio, so I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
And since we already know each other through a couple of previous engagements, may I call you Maya during this interview?
Of course.
Okay, I will. It feels more comfortable than continuing to refer you in the formal sense. Okay, so yes, let's. Thanks for doing this. Dr. Shetreat also interviewed me somewhat recently for a summit, which we're going to talk about as well. And but I want to start by asking you, why did you get, or what motivated you to get into fields associated with work in psychedelics?
Um, I was thinking about that the other day. Um, feel like that should be something I know the answer to, and and I realized it actually as I was recording interviews for the summit that I'm working on right now, and it was actually when I went to Ecuador for the very first time. I went because I wanted to learn about teacher plants, but not specifically psychedelics. In fact, I felt very apprehensive
Hmm.
about working with those plants. I had had some experiences in my teen years, and since then had really not been that engaged with those medicines, and didn't think of them as medicines in that way, or in the way that I do now. And I had a really very profound experience on that trip with the San Pedro Cactus. I would actually say it was one of the most profound experiences I've had in my life of any kind, and it was a very gentle experience where it didn't feel like I have since then had many plant medicine experiences of various kinds, and this was just so gentle and so loving, and basically the plant told me we were going to be partnering together. And I had almost completely forgotten about it until I just the other day found my journal and went and looked at it from that trip, that 3-week trip that I went to in Ecuador. And so what really excited me at that time was that there was this whole world of sacred and ritual and ancient practice and ancient relationship and kinship that had existed for such a long time. And I was able to see all of those things through that lens, but also through the lens of science and of neuroscience and of neurology and of medicine, in terms of like treating people who are physically or, you know, struggling with mental illness. And somehow those two things coming together were really inspiring to me, and really felt like felt like I was being kind of called into my purpose. And the more that I learned about the science and the neuroscience following that trip and that experience, the more interested and excited I became, and the more I felt I had a responsibility to make sure that people kept in mind the sacred elements of these medicines, because it's so easy, and we can talk about this more, but it's so easy in our culture to get very carried away, to medicalize things and to kind of apply that lens of science and what can this do for us, and not to really think about how can we do this sustainably, and how are we giving back, and how are we staying in our humility and being, you know, giving, you know, gratitude and being in good relationship. So that is where I kind of feel like is my sweet spot.
That's great. So, what have you been doing to educate and advocate for that particular aspect of the understanding?
Well, so first and foremost, you know, I like to, you know, I build a relationship with the plants that I work with, and the way that I do that is not just through, you know, I think a lot of people think of that as like you're ingesting it or you're in ceremony and all of those things. For me, it actually begins with growing the plants and spending time with them and learning what they want, what they need. And so I have an ayahuasca vine that I grow, and I've had to really learn. She is an interesting teacher. I could tell you some stories about the experience of growing ayahuasca.
Please do. Not too many people are growing ayahuasca up here.
Well, sorry, I'm not in New York City, that's for sure. Although, who knows? But, and I don't, just to be clear, these relationships that I have, including also with San Pedro Cactus, and you know, I have about 50 of those that I'm growing, and it's, again, a kind of long story of how that happened, but I have many of these really beautiful master plants, and not to ingest, but to develop and cultivate an intimate relationship with them. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of things that I might do, you know, but I really am just coming and being of service and tending them. And that is the way that I build that relationship, so that I can know what I'm being called to do or asked to do. So I'll tell you the story about growing the ayahuasca vine. I found this ayahuasca. I found a nursery online. This was many, many, many years ago now. That was selling an ayahuasca vine, and I, you know, it was like maybe 2 or 3 years old, and I ordered the plant, and she arrived, you know, in pretty good condition, I thought, and I put her in my sunroom because I was going away for a few days. So I asked, you know, my kids while I was gone, I said, just water her. She's in our little sunroom. And when I came back with my teacher, who was, you know, she is a fourth generation shaman and an ethnobotanist. And so she was staying with me and teaching while she was here. And we arrived back like 3 or 4 days later, and the ayahuasca vine was covered in white cottony, like some kind of infestation. And we did, you know, my teacher freaked out and I freaked out, and we were like, you know, basically did ayahuasca CPR, you know, wash the leaves with soap and whatever. She said you have to put a red ribbon on her pot and, you know, put her outside and all these things. And we did all those things. And she said to me later, she said, you know, there's something I didn't tell you about this plant and growing this plant. And I said, what did you not tell me? And she said, well, if you're not paying enough attention to her, she'll do things to call your attention. And I said, well, what do you mean? I was like, because, you know, like spiritual teachers often speak in, you know, cryptic ways. And I was like, I'm going to need you to be very clear with me what you're trying to tell me, if you can be. And she said, no, 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 it's okay. It's just, she'll do things to make sure that you don't ignore her. So I was
Mm.
like, all right. Um, and I told later that night, I told my husband, my husband at the time, I said, oh, you know, this plant, this is what, you know, my teacher said. And he said, well, I don't like that at all. He said, can't we like divorce this plant?
Oh.
Absolutely not. I was like, I'm so excited and I want to, you know, I want to grow her. I want to take care of her and so on. Um, a few years later, I still have the plant. I'm no longer married. So
Oh.
she took care of that situation, I guess. Um, but you know, it's been an interesting journey. So like when I go a little too long without paying attention to her, like she'll just, her leaves will dry and they'll just all drop off.
Mm.
Not because I'm not taking care of her, but she is like, I would say like a very dramatic plant. She's like, requires a lot of attention. And so I've learned to really, you know, she only wants to grow on living trees. So I had put sticks or logs next to her. She didn't grow up those, but she will grow up only if I get live trees. Also, I brought into my house. So she has to have her jungle in order to be able to wind up and become this bigger vine. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, these are the things I think, you know, I don't want to get too tiresome about it, but these are the kinds of things that I think a lot of people um, might not realize if they're only sourcing their medicine, you know, by going to ceremony, but never really getting to greet the ayahuasca vine herself and build that relationship. And for me, it's like, you know, I excuse the analogy, but you know, I don't want to just like meet someone and jump into bed with them, right? I would want to like cultivate the intimacy and make sure that there's this like, you know, sense of closeness and you know, sort of attraction in some way. And so that's the way that I build these relationships, because for me, all the plants that I work with, whether it's cacao, whether it's cannabis, whether it's ayahuasca, any of the plants, San Pedro, um, you know, they are living beings and they, you know, are just to me like people, but really more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's Wade Davis has said that a few times that you know, plants are just people in another realm, right? Um, yeah, so that's wonderful, and I agree with you. I think that is so important that people have that relationship. I think it's central to the kind of change that we need to go through on this planet. Is that, you know, you think about if you grow up in an urban area, you go to, you know, the grocery store and you buy your produce and so on, and you never think about where it comes from or what was involved in that whole process from the point where it was, you know, initially grown and all that kind of thing. Yeah, and then there's this issue of which is kind of, you know, the same more or less. Uh, and I'd actually like to ask you if you have some thoughts about this for those who are watching or listening who maybe haven't had any experiences where they've sensed the living spirit, as it were, of some of these plant medicines. You know, the skeptics, the rational reductionists would say, you know, it's just nonsense, or it's all in your mind, or projection, or all that kind of thing. But then you get people like, for example, I've forgotten his name, but I found him a little quote by this Peruvian shaman who had been at a scientific medical conference in Lima. Excuse me, and he said something like, well, we don't, you know, we have a lot of respect for what Western medicine can do, but we believe it's only half the solution. The other half is connecting with the spirit of the medicine plant. And then you have, just to, before I turn it back over to you, you have Eliot Cowan, who I believe you're familiar with his work. Yeah. And if I'm sort of loosely quoting him, he said something like, what makes a plant medicine is your connection to it. And he said he can, when he's working with a client, he doesn't even have to administer the plant either to himself or the patient. When he's made that relationship, the spirit of the plant will come in. I'd say that's still kind of far-flung understanding or cosmology to a lot of Western people. So I'm not exactly even sure what the question I have for you is, but it's something like, how real is that? And, anything else that you can think of that can help educate people on that issue.
Yeah. I think one of the most challenging things that we are having to break through right now is this idea that there's only one way of knowing. And right now, the one way of knowing that we happen to have adopted and embraced and venerated is science. And I love science, as I've stated. For me, that is a beautiful language, and it's one that I'm very drawn to. And I consider myself a scientist, and in the context of my medical training and a lot of other things that I've done. But I think what we have lost or forgotten is that there are many ways of knowing, and science is only one language that describes the mystery of the world, but there are many such languages. And that was what kind of, and I don't want to get sidetracked by this, but I had a really, really interesting experience at a very pivotal moment in my life with ancient astrology. I didn't know at the time, one of the most preeminent scholars in the world in Western astrology. I had no idea, but it was a very profound experience, and I recognized in that moment that astrology also was this ancient language, and I started to study that because I wanted to understand that language. And there are many languages. Indigenous wisdom has a whole repertoire of science, and that science is just different, a different language, a different way of talking about medicine and health and ecosystems, but it's a very tried and true and I think well-established way of knowing. So I think part of what I'm saying here is, we want to think that we're evolving and that everything that came before is sort of more primitive or not as good or, not as advanced. And I think what we're recognizing and what I love about all the science coming out around psychedelics is that it's actually showing that these indigenous practices, these ancient practices that have been around probably since the very beginning of time, of humans certainly, is actually, we're showing through the language that we speak now of knowing, this kind of evidence-based research approach, that this wasn't just some primitive thing that all of our more advanced medicine is better than. It's actually, we're finding that it actually can heal a wide array of physical and mental and emotional and spiritual kinds of suffering. And it does it better than almost anything else so far, at least, that we know about. I mean, it's not necessarily, if you're in a car accident and you break a bunch of bones, you're not going to necessarily, first thing you do is not going to be go take psilocybin to, heal everything, although it may not hurt, but you're going to want to be patched up and get stitches and, have your bones set and all of that. And that Western medicine is really good at. But there's a whole array of conditions that Western medicine is actually not very good at. And it happens to be that we're living through many epidemics, and I'm not even talking about the pandemic, that we are all referring to right now, but just many epidemics right now of chronic illness that we don't have good treatments for. And it looks like plant medicines, well, herbal medicines and, master plants like psychedelics are very much, um, you know, have a lot of efficacy where other pharmaceuticals or approaches may not.
Hmm. Well put. Uh, one question that comes up for me in that general line of thinking is there are a lot of concerns right now. I don't know, a lot of concerns. There are concerns within the sort of loosely defined psychedelic community on two issues that may be related. One is, you mentioned this term medicalization earlier on in the conversation, that there's concern that as these medicines, sacraments, become legally sanctioned, legally approved, they will be controlled overly by old boys clubs, so to speak, by medical bureaucracies and so on, and their use will be limited in other circumstances, which is probably the way it's going to go to begin with anyway. But anyway, I would like you to address that concern, but maybe somehow, bunched in with that is the corporatization issue, which is also drawing a lot of attention in this sort of larger, loosely defined psychedelic community these days. That there's a lot of investment, hundreds of millions of dollars from very rich people, sometimes celebrities, are going into psilocybin, for example, based on a kind of a bet or gamble that they're going to get legalized enough for them to realize return on these. But I think the concern is that a lot of these people, they don't really care about the central value of these things in the first place. They're they're just looking to make a profit, a lot of them, and again. Maybe corrupting the relationship that you've already been talking about here, connecting with the spirit of the plant, that kind of thing. I know that there are people studying variations, that they can patent, for some of these things, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them are trying to they're trying to figure out how psilocybin can work without the psychoactive effect, for example. So how do you feel about what's happening with all that?
I have concern. I
Mm-hmm.
really do. I think, the example I would use, and when I teach about it, is when I went to Ecuador for the very first time, a friend of mine who had been there said, he said, the one piece of advice I would give you is don't be afraid if you're at altitude to drink coca tea or chew the coca leaf. And, he said that because obviously there's a lot of stigma around the coca plant because, it's the source of cocaine or, the origin or whatever. And indeed, I was at high altitude and I had been taking many herbs and like reishi and ginkgo and all these things to prepare for being at altitude and had been pretty much okay. But at one point we went to a very, very high altitude and someone, we stopped at a botanica and somebody, got coca leaves and they just handed it to me because, and a bunch of us were very lightheaded and I felt, like my heart was beating really quickly and was tachycardic and so on and so forth. So I chewed the leaf and within really 5-10 minutes felt perfectly fine, was able to kind of continue the whole trip and do go to hot springs and, all kinds of things. And, it was a really interesting experience to interact with that plant and kind of just consider how we've taken a plant that is a sacred plant, a master plant, that indigenous people have used and continue to use actually for energy and for mental clarity and for altitude and so on and so forth. And we've kind of turned it into, right, by purifying it, by finding what gives kind of the biggest high. And, many other things. I'm not going to get into all of the details about it, but what we've done is we haven't come in right relationship, right? We're not coming in with a sense of reciprocity. We were not coming with all of those things that it has now kind of become, the plant has gone from being something that could be incredibly helpful and supportive to something that can destroy people. And these are very powerful plants. We could talk about tobacco as well. We could talk about the poppy, the opium poppy, right? The poppy is amazing. For people who don't know, if you grow poppy, it is illegal to make medicine of um, the flower, and it's not just the flower, but kind of the pod, okay? And when it's fresh, you can actually tincture it, and it becomes an excellent painkiller. But it's against the law to do that because of, obvious reasons. But it happens to be wonderful for pain. And it's like, because we have not been able to manage our demands and our desires and, show respect, I think, for these plants, they can be incredibly powerful and actually really hurt us because we're not coming with the right approach and the right respect. So all of that to say, I do have concern. I think, I think we're being asked again to come in right relationship, and it is going to be up to the people who care and who are thinking about these things, like you and me, and I think many others, to really use our voices and our platforms and our experience and our credentials and, share that information, because I don't know that we're going to be able to stop this medicalization, this corporatization, because that's the nature of the society we live in. But I think we have to at least try, at least share that other piece, because I'm not of the mindset that, if everybody would just use psilocybin or a psychedelic, it would heal the world. Like, I don't think that that's necessarily true. I haven't seen it to be true. I think a lot of people who can be very, have a lot of power and greed and all those things have used psychedelics. And it doesn't necessarily just automatically make you a good person or automatically make you operate with respect and reverence and kinship, right? So we have to still be doing the work of giving people opportunities to engage with that kind of knowledge and to re-educate, because our culture's really lost that way of operating. We have to show up if we have access to that way of knowing.
Yeah, well put. Very important. I agree. And as almost a kind of aside, I've been increasingly, what's the word? Not as intense as shocked, but somewhat surprised, I guess you could say, and a little bit dismayed over the years. I've been around the psychedelic world for quite a long time now to see that, there are often people who have taken a lot of ayahuasca, for example. Maybe they've done 100, ayahuasca journeys, and they probably had a lot of amazing experiences, and yet they still don't seem to have softened the ego or somehow, cleared their mind up and become humble, and compassionate particularly. So I find that a little, I guess, disappointing in a way. And I know some other elders that are a little disappointed where the psychedelic renaissance has, what it has come to and where it's going. I won't mention any names, but one woman in particular who I consider very wise and a long-time psychedelic, educator, etc., is has that kind of jaded dismay feeling going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think you're right. I know a lot of people who go back to the medicine again and again and again and again and again and again, but may not be doing the kind of integrating that they could be doing, let's say. And I'm certainly not going to say I have all the spiritual answers here. We're all on our journeys, and we're all, we all have our ego to work through and our shadow to work through and so on. But, I do remember having gone to an ayahuasca ceremony, and one of the people who was a helper there had also ran many of her own ceremonies, and had engaged with that medicine many, 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 many times. And I had a really difficult journey. I often do with I often do with Mama Ayahuasca, and she this person after the fact was like very judgmental of the the journey that I had, and I knew this because I don't tend to share with people that I'm a physician, or that I've done whatever I'm doing professionally or in my career, because it's not relevant, I don't feel, and it also makes people act differently. And so at a certain point, afterwards, it came out, kind of, and she was very shocked, assumed that because I had had this difficult experience, that therefore I must not be like a very, you know, able person. Or it was just a very interesting experience for me, and I kind of never forgot that. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, sort of, I don't know if this is really the nice thing to say, but there's sort of this idea of like, even in the spiritual world of like, some people's shit doesn't stink. Am I allowed to say that? But like, they think that they're like better than everybody else because X, Y, and Z, and all you're seeing there is their ego,
Mm-hmm.
kind of all over again. But somehow they've tied it up with the fact that they're engaged with these plants, and I don't think that's, I don't think that's the way to. I don't think that's what these plants are asking of us. Let me say it like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important caution for people in, working with these plants because, as you're implying there, you can, you have you may have these experiences that are quite remarkable and, very real in a sense, much beyond the sort of conditioned ego. And if you haven't done that kind of grounding work, that shadow work and all that kind of stuff, particularly in an ongoing way, it is a seduction to think that, you have an inside track on things, and that can feed the ego, of course, right? Yeah, so I think it's a really important concern. Maybe I could, there's a line in this bio that I read earlier. I want to, pardon my not looking at the camera for a minute. I just want to find that line again and ask you what you're doing. Here it is. This certification program that you're doing that trains people to lead communities in integrating rituals and earth-based practices. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what that is, what you're doing with that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I find actually the most profound, and why I started the Terrain Institute to begin with, actually, was so that I could offer opportunities for people to engage with their own healing. And when I say healing, I mean physical, emotional, spiritual, ecological, like communal, right? So for me, and in the lineage that I've studied, it's, we have our body is physical, emotional, spiritual, part of a community, part of an ecology or an ecosystem. And so but we have such limited language around that. So our language is mostly around our physical well-being, a little bit around mental well-being. Maybe we're getting better at that right now. Emotional and spiritual and communal, not so much at all. Theological, we have something, but I don't think we really understand it very well, although there are more and more scholars who are sort of putting out their knowledge in various ways. So I wanted to create an opportunity for people to engage in all of those different ways of understanding themselves as physical, emotional, spiritual, and communal beings. And so my certification is basically a deep dive into, first looking at, for example, you asked the question, well, what do we say to these people who are hyper rational and say plants don't have spirits, or say, that we can, that there's nothing real beyond like what we can see in front of our eyes, or so on and so forth. So part of it is looking at sacred tradition and science around our ability to perceive, right? And that, kind of talking about the invisible connections that we have that are measurable, like the electromagnetic field or the biofield. There's all this really beautiful science around that, and how that is part of what connects us to other living beings around us, people, or the microbiome, or trees, and so on and so forth. And look at things like, for example, in areas where trees die, more people die. And not because of oxygen or things like that. Like they die more, like if there's an infestation of trees, more people get sick. And there's just real, and people don't really understand why. And so part of what I do is go into this kind of idea of the shared community that we're in with the natural world. And we look at it in a lot of different ways. We look at it through plants, we look at it through animals, we look at it through, we do our own kind of deep dive into all of the ways that our relationships actually basically create our health. We cannot be healthy or have well-being without being in relationship with microbes and mitochondria within us, and with plants, animals, seeds, sun, soil, wind, water, etc., around us. So that's what this certification is about, is really understanding our well-being from a place of kinship.
So, some sort of more specific questions about that. What are they, people who complete that program then certified to do? How is the course done? Like, is it online? How long is it? And is it available? Can people sign up for it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is done online and with live calls. So we have community calls, which is, I think, a really important and profound part of the experience for most people. And they're being certified to become leaders in their community, to bring this science and these practices. And we do rituals, we do, everything from plant bathing to various kinds of breathing exercises to celebrating things like solstice and equinox and the moon, and looking at, how that impacts us and how that was used in history, and how it's been used around the world to guide kind of communal healing and communal gathering and communal celebration. So all of those sorts of things. So people come with all different kinds of backgrounds, which I love. And that was actually my vision, was this would not just be for like healthcare providers, for example, even though there are many healthcare providers of various kinds who come through the training, but also we have teachers, and we have, various kinds of, like we had an entrepreneur, and we had someone who ran a media company, and like people who want to integrate this wisdom into the work that they're doing as a leader. And so part of what we teach in the program is how to build community and how to actually engage in leadership. So it's a leadership training, but it's bringing in this particular kind of wisdom into whatever specialty someone might have or is interested in having. I want this because I think that this idea of kinship and humility and reciprocity and, kind of communal health, it needs to come from all angles, like from artists and entrepreneurs and healers and doctors and teachers. Like it needs to become part of the tapestry of our society. So that is the practice, and it is a year-long course, and it will be open again for registration. People can get on the wait list now. It will be open again in early 2022, and it's been a really beautiful experience because it's incredibly transformative. And we have had live retreats. The pandemic made it a little more challenging, but we have
No doubt.
here had some live retreats, and people were so, I'm trying to think, of what the word is, but it was just like so joyful that we were, after being online together, able to all come together and actually do some of the work that we'd been studying in person. And for me, I think building community locally with the people around us and in our workplace and so on, it could be more important. I think it's more important now than ever, especially with these ideas of virtual, meta, and having a whole online life, virtual life it's a little scary to me that, we're going in that direction. And I think we need to connect to our ecosystem, to our food, to our neighbors, find our people. Um, so yeah, this is really, obviously I'm very passionate about this.
That's a brilliant idea. I'm just could hardly wait for the culture to be infused with a lot more people with that kind of understanding. That's fantastic. Uh, I actually have. I don't know if there's even time. I know you have to go in a little more than 10 minutes, so I have two more things I want to ask you about. But just before that, I told you at the end I was going to ask you for some links. But because you were just talking about the training program, is there? Can you put? I can put it in a tile under the screen here. Is there a place for people to go check out the program?
Well, everything that I offer is on my website at
Okay.
drmaya.com, drmaya.com. Um, and, on that page, you'll find the certification program. You'll find the psychedelics masterclass I teach. You'll find my herbalism programs, and, everything else that I do is available there as well. So that's the safest place to go. And you'll find virtually everything that I'm offering, and
Excellent.
a lot of free resources as well. That's really important to me. Also, is that there's a whole page of just free resources and practices and videos and meditations that people can engage with.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah. So I want to try to squeeze in two more things before we go. One of them could be a whole interview on its own because I know you're familiar with cannabis and you have an interesting perspective because you're also as you say, a scientist and an MD. So you've encountered cannabis through that kind of work and through your clients, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering, I'm not even sure what the best question is, but something perhaps like, and we should keep it fairly short so that I can still ask you about the summit before we're done here. But maybe something like how do you see cannabis fitting in to the pantheon of psychedelics? I know it's not technically a psychedelic, but I think you and I might agree that when it's used properly, in the right hands, et cetera, it has very powerful, potential to open people up. Anyway, how do you see it fitting in that way? And any other thoughts that you can put into, 3 or 4 minutes about, things that are, the positives and the concerns about working with that plant.
Absolutely. You know, um, as with all these medicines, these potent teacher plants, master plants, um, I always feel measured in the way that I will talk about them as medicine. Um, I think they're very powerful, and I think cannabis is very powerful, um, and very seductive. I mean, if you've been around cannabis growing, and I'm lucky enough to have a very dear friend who's a certified cannabis grower, so I go and help with harvest, and every year, and it truly is like this seductive experience to be with these beautiful and fragrant plants. It's just like an amazing transformative kind of experience. I think that there's a tremendous amount of potential and power in these plants. From a medical standpoint, I think we're really complicating things because so often we're not using whole plant. And I am a big believer that the plants have their own innate intelligence. Not to say that we can never purify something out and so on. I'm not a purist all the time, but I think that, the best medicines, like we in the beginning thought, oh, there's CBD and there's THC, but then, we learn about all these terpenes. And I mean, obviously growers and, cultivators have known about these for a long time, but nobody was really talking about that. Now we understand that the spectrum of the terpenes really probably tells us a lot more than, the particular strain of plant, or is it tall, or is it stout, or all these other things that people have been using. So I think we are very ignorant still in our knowledge of these plants that just have so much to teach us. So I tend to believe in whole plant as much as possible, and therefore it's a little bit difficult because in my patients who have used these, let's say for seizures or for anxiety or for insomnia or from, for any number of different conditions. I don't need to list them all. I think we know. They're not necessarily always the miracle cure, like kind of the panacea that they're made out to be. But I think part of that has to do with that, they're not always getting medicines that are, coming from someone like my dear friend who is a grower, Tammy Sweet, who, sings to the plants and, feeds the plants and touches the plants and hand harvests and, right, like it's just a whole different thing than what a lot of these medicines are. On the other side of it, I think cannabis, just medically speaking, is really exciting. I think engaging with the endocannabinoid system and understanding more about that system has been really exciting and validating for me, and I think for a lot of people who have these sorts of mystery illnesses like recurrent miscarriage or phantom limb syndrome or, severe recurrent migraines or just a lot of conditions that were kind of untreatable, intractable, it's all in your head. I mean, just all kinds of, fibromyalgia, like all of these conditions that seem to be, in many cases, or failure to thrive in babies, a dysfunction of the endocannabinoid system, this global safety system. And the body doesn't feel safe, by way of the endocannabinoid system. There's a lot of ways that it acts dysregulated, that its functions are dysregulated. So to me, what's very exciting is when we have research about whole plant, how that engages the full system, and medically speaking, not to speak of the spiritual and the emotional and those other pieces, but even just medically speaking, what will that do for these incredibly difficult to treat conditions? I think it's very exciting, and I think we're going to learn a lot.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that. And, I love this, the notion of, how you care for the plant as being important. It's been something that's been on my mind for a number of years. So that's great. So in our relatively short remaining time, I do want to ask you about this summit. The last time you wrote me something about it, you were calling it the new science of ancient medicines, healing trauma, and building resilience with mushrooms and psychedelics. So can you say a little bit about that? What was your initial intention behind it, and what do you hope will come out of it?
Well, yeah. So we have this summit that will be out in March 2022, and going back to what we said before, I felt a responsibility to share a balanced view, looking at both the science, which is very exciting, and taking also a sacred perspective and looking at tradition and looking at indigenous experience and history and religious experience around it as well. And we have over 40 excellent speakers, of which you are one. So my goal was really in the medical community, there's still a lot of stigma around psychedelics and in the general community, on the one hand. And then there are also the people, of course, who think it's going to be the cure for everything. And I wanted to really give people a more balanced view of, and maybe just a framework for how to look at both the really exciting advances in science and medicine, and also what could go wrong, like some of the things that we discussed, and what the pitfalls might be, who it's for, who it might not be for, how to have a good experience if it's something that you are engaging with, how to think about sustainability of certain plants. Are we going to overuse them? So on and so on. So obviously, I would love it to be the most comprehensive thing ever. I think you and I know that, there's only so much we can communicate in any one event, but I think we have a really beautiful array of speakers and leaders and visionaries and luminaries in the field who are going to be sharing beautiful knowledge.
And again, your website would be the place to find out about that, or is there another source?
So the it's best to come to my website because um, this you'll basically, if you sign up for my email list, you'll be notified. Our website will be up for the event itself in January. So that, but you'll find it on my website, and you'll be able to get the link there. So going to drmaya.com, um, basically first week of January or second week of January, the website will be up and ready to sign up, and it's free, a free event, free and online the week of March 4th.
Incredible. Well, at the risk of flattering your ego, I want to say quite sincerely that you amaze me. You know, you have the blessed combination of talents that you know, you have the visionary component, and you have the organizational chops, along with the ability to articulate this material quite clearly, as people who have followed us through in this interview would be well aware. So, you know, thank you so much for what you're doing. Most appreciated, and thanks for doing this with me.
Well, it's my absolute pleasure, and I just want to say that I don't do all of this myself. I have a really wonderful team, small team, but very able team of people who are far more organized than I am.
Well,
Just to give people their due, I'm very blessed with that. And but yeah, it was such a pleasure to be here, and I feel like we could talk forever. So it
well,
was really
maybe we'll have to do it again. You know, perhaps after the summit, and you know, you'll have a lot of you'll have some fresh material to share at that point, I'm sure. Yeah. And, you know, this work is going to be going on for the rest of our lives and beyond. So, you know, may it be blessed. May it be supported in all ways. So, again, thank you very much. And I'll let you go on to your next imminent session.